Today, we're diving into the story of a true revolutionary. A man who didn't just build a company, he completely changed how we interact with the world around us. So let's get into the incredible life of Steve Jobs. This was so much more than just a slick ad campaign for Apple. This was his mission statement. This was his personal creed. He was every single one of those words. Because behind that iconic black turtleneck and those perfectly designed products was a man who was complex, incredibly driven, and, let's be honest, often really difficult. To get the revolution, you first have to get the man. And his story, well, like all the great ones, it starts from a really unconventional place. His whole way of looking at the world was shaped by being an outsider, right from the very beginning. So, he was adopted at birth, and his father, Paul, who was a machinist, taught him something that would stick with him forever. Craftsmanship matters, even the parts that no one will ever see. This obsession with details started super early. But school, he couldn't stand it. He was labeled a troublemaker, but really, he was just bored out of his mind. His brain was already on a totally different wavelength. And then he met Steve Wozniak. Their partnership was just this perfect fusion of skills. Woz was the engineering genius who could literally build anything. But Jobs, he was the visionary. He knew what to build, and maybe even more important, he knew how to make the world want it. Without both of them, there's just no Apple. Simple as that. This right here is the perfect example of his special gift. He drops out of college, right? And just for fun, he wanders into a calligraphy class. Years and years later, that totally random, seemingly useless skill becomes the very foundation for the Mac's beautiful fonts. He just had this unbelievable knack for connecting dots that nobody else even knew were there. So, with this unique blend of vision, design, and partnership, what started in a dusty garage was about to absolutely explode onto the world stage and change, well, pretty much everything. The speed of it all was just insane. Think about it. In 1976, it's two guys in a garage. Just 1 year later, the Apple II is a runaway success. And then, by '84, the Macintosh arrives, introduced with that now legendary Super Bowl ad. Apple wasn't just another company, it was becoming a cultural force. And the success was just staggering. By the time he was only 25 years old, Steve Jobs was worth over $200 million. But that number, as massive as it is, was really just a side effect of what he was actually after. See, his real motivation was never the money. It was this deep, burning obsession with perfection. He pushed his teams right to their breaking points, demanding not just good, but insanely great. And that relentless and, often brutal perfectionism is what defined his products and his leadership. But that same fire that fueled all his success was also about to lead to the most devastating moment of his entire career. A fall from grace that absolutely nobody saw coming. As Apple ballooned into this massive corporation, Jobs' renegade styles started to really clash with the whole boardroom culture. His famous reality distortion field, that magnetic charisma he used to convince engineers that the impossible was possible, it just didn't work on the suits. He was notoriously difficult, and he ended up alienating the very people he had brought in to run the company. And then the unthinkable happened. In 1985, the board of directors sided against him. At just 30 years old, Steve Jobs was unceremoniously fired from the company he had poured his entire soul into. He was out, an outcast. Years later, he'd look back on this moment with this incredible perspective. Sure, it was a public humiliation, but he saw it as this necessary, if incredibly painful lesson that ended up setting the stage for everything that came next. And what came next? Oh man, it wasn't just a comeback. You could argue it's the single greatest second act in the history of modern business. Because by the mid-90s, the Apple he had founded was basically on life support. Without his vision, it had completely lost its way. Its market share had vanished, and pretty much everyone thought it was a dying brand. But Jobs hadn't just been sitting around. He founded a new computer company next. And while it wasn't a huge commercial success, it developed some amazing software. Even more important, he bought a tiny graphics studio from George Lucas and turned it into Pixar, releasing the world's first computer-animated movie, Toy Story. So when a desperate Apple bought Next in 1997, Jobs came home, and he just unleashed this absolute torrent of innovation that no one could have predicted, one after another. iMac, iPod, iTunes, iPhone, iPad.
These products didn't just save Apple, they completely redefined entire industries, from music to phones to computing itself. But as he reached the absolute peak of his success, he was forced to confront his own mortality, and that confrontation would sharpen his focus and really define his final legacy.
In 2003, he was diagnosed with a rare kind of pancreatic cancer. This diagnosis made him grapple with the one thing he couldn't control, time. And it gave him this profound sense of clarity about what he absolutely had to get done with the years he had left.
He shared this idea in his famous Stanford commencement speech. For him, knowing that death was coming wasn't something to fear. It was a tool. It was liberating. It was a way to cut through all the noise and expectations and pride and just focus on what was truly deeply important. On October 5th, 2011, Steve Jobs passed away. And according to his sister, his very last words were simple and kind of mysterious. Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow. One last curious observation from a man who always saw things differently.
So what's his ultimate legacy? Well, it's the idea that design matters, that simplicity is power, that the experience you have with a product is everything. And maybe, most powerfully of all, it's the proof that the crazy ones, the misfits, who are just crazy enough to think they can change the world, are the ones who actually do. Jobs always talked about his mission to put a dent in the universe. He certainly put his. Which really just leaves us with one final provocative question he might have asked. What about you?